Now we've come to one of the most rewarding parts of our whole series, the harvest. We're going to share a few tips and tricks on how to ensure that you harvest plants at their peak ripeness and maturity, because that's also when the plants are usually the most nutritious and the most delicious. However, there's a few tricks and recommendations we want to give y'all. First, when you harvest, try to shoot for either the morning when it's a little bit cooler or the evening as well. It's good to keep your plants out of the high heat of the day and even out of the sun once you do harvest them to ensure that they don't wilt on you right away or continue to ripen. Another one to keep in mind is to put them in the fridge as quickly as possible. Again, you can get that field heat out of your plants quickly, but there are a few exceptions to that. One thing to keep in mind too is that a lot of crops have either a short window of harvest or a longer window of harvest. A short window of harvest are some crops that once they hit maturity, you need to harvest them fairly quickly. Otherwise, they could become over-mature and inedible, maybe rot or get woody and not so tasty. That includes things like okra, cucumbers, and tomatoes. Other crops have a longer harvest window, things like carrots, kale, and Swiss chard, where you can wait a little bit of time and they might get a little bit bigger, but they're still good to eat. And you don't have to worry about getting them right on the stick to make sure they're sort of healthy and delicious. It's also important to remember as you harvest, try not to bruise, scrape, or scratch your produce as you take it off the plant and into your home. This can shorten its shelf life and potentially begin the rotting process a little bit too early. So now we're going to take a peek at a few of the crops that are ready here in our gardens. If you have any questions or don't see a crop here today that you want to know how to harvest, take a look at your Seed to Supper manual or do a little bit of research online. So today we're going to harvest some of our green cabbages. So what we're looking for a mature, healthy, ready-to-eat cabbage is a nice, firm head. And so this one right in front of me is a great example. It's got a nice size to it, and it's nice and firm. So what I mean by that is when I touch it and I feel it, I can feel that it's nice and firm. Some of these other cabbages in here aren't quite ready to harvest, not quite mature enough. When I feel them, they're a little bit smaller, maybe a little bit less dense and tightly packed in the head. This one's really nice and densely packed. Others that are a little over mature are something like this, where you can see it's busting out. It's actually had a little bit too much water and it's been in the ground a little bit too long, so it's starting to bust open. And so it's ready to eat right now, and you should harvest it right away if you see this and you put it in your fridge, and that's just fine. But really the best stage to harvest a cabbage is one just like this. So to harvest it, I'm going to take my harvest knife or maybe a pair of pruners or cutters. I'm going to bend it over right on the stem over here. I'm going to slice right through, and I've got it freed up just like this. All these leaves are totally edible. They're great to eat, even if they have a little bit of insect damage. That's a-okay, because this is an organic garden, and that's just a sign that other critters are nibbling on this food, and it's good for us to eat too. But I'm going to pull off a few of the really damaged ones, put that in my compost pile. If I have a little nub after I've broken off some of the uglier leaves, I might cut that off as well. Then we have ourselves a beautiful head of cabbage. What I'm going to do with this is either I'm going to use it today, put it in something I like to eat, or I'll put it in the fridge, put it in either the crisper drawer or maybe a plastic bag to keep it nice and moist and keep it really healthy and fresh for the time I am going to use it. And that's how you harvest green cabbage. So now we're going to harvest some collard greens. A lot of plants that are like this include things like kale, these collards, as well as Swiss chard, and they're all harvested in a very similar way. They're edible at any stage and any age, but what we're looking for today are full mature leaves that we harvest from the bottom up. And so we come over to our plant and we look on the bottom here, and you can see that we have been harvesting for a few weeks now, and so there's a bit of a length of stem there. But what we'll do is we'll harvest this bottom leaf, just snapping it right off with our hand, or you can use a pair of scissors or a knife to do that as well. But we'll snap off all these healthy green leaves. If you see any leaves that are yellowing or have lots of holes in them, you can take those off and put those in your compost pile. But a few holes isn't a big deal. That's a good sign that you have a healthy garden, and they're completely edible and safe to eat. So one thing you want to avoid is cutting the top of the plant. That's where it continues to grow new growth. And so you don't want to cut the top right there so that it will stop growing and basically the collard won't produce any more. Once you have healthy green leaves, you can put these in the fridge in a plastic bag that you keep open in your crisper drawer or just anywhere in your fridge. So over here is some dino kale. It's one of the most delicious types of kale we grow in the garden. All the kale that we grow, and similar to the collard greens, are harvested very similarly, where we'll harvest from the most mature leaves on the bottom or on the outside, working our way up. If we see any leaves that are a little bit too holy or eaten up by insects, we might put those in the compost pile, but everything's edible and safe to eat. So here we've got some Swiss chard or some rainbow chard. You can see all the beautiful different colors, and we harvest it a lot like the collard greens and kale, where we'll harvest the lower leaves first, working our way up, but it's edible at any stage. One thing about Swiss chard is you can snap it right off at the base, but you risk pulling the whole plant out because it's attached a little bit more to the stem of the plant. So what I prefer to do is get my harvest knife or maybe a pair of scissors and just snip it right off at the base. You can harvest any size of leaf you like, getting as really close to the base as you can, because this beautiful rainbow colored stem is completely edible and delicious. You might just have to cook it a little bit longer than the greens. But you go through and harvest all your large leaves right there at the bottom or on the edge. Once you've got all your leaves that you want harvested, you store them in the fridge in a plastic bag or in the crisper drawer with the plastic bag open to keep them nice and fresh.
This here is a beautiful bed of sweet potato greens. The sweet potatoes themselves won't be ready to eat for another couple months later on in September, but we can start harvesting the greens themselves right now. A lot of people say that you shouldn't bother growing sweet potatoes if you're only growing in a very small space, because as you can see, they take up a lot of space, and the relative value of the sweet potato itself is pretty low. But if you're growing the plant for the leaves as well, it can be a more worthwhile endeavor. Sweet potato greens are eaten throughout many parts of Asia and Africa and can be eaten raw or cooked in soups, stews, curries, or sautéed like spinach. To harvest the sweet potato green, you're going to look for an individual vine like this, and you're going to cut it back probably about 2 feet, taking that tenderest part, that newest growth on the end. The part that you'll use is the leaf itself and these more tender stems that the leaf is attached to. The tougher vine you can toss in the compost because that's a little bit too tough to eat. One thing to watch out for on sweet potatoes is you're often going to see a few little holes, some bug damage on them, and that's okay. The rest of those greens are totally good to eat. For harvesting potatoes, I like to use a digging fork like this, but you can use a shovel or a trowel or anything you have on hand that can get deep enough into the ground to go underneath the potatoes. So you're looking to get maybe about 6 inches down. With the fork, I'm going to take it and put it a few inches away from the base of the plant, far enough away so that when I dig down, I'm not going to be stabbing the potatoes. And I'm also going to make sure I keep it straight up and down instead of tilting it in towards the plant, again, so that I don't stab the potatoes. You might stab a couple potatoes in the process of harvesting them, that's okay, but they're not going to keep as long. So you want to make sure to eat those ones sooner than the others. So for digging them, I'm going to push the fork down. Sometimes it takes a little extra effort. You got to shake it around a little bit. And then I'm going to carefully tilt the fork back or the shovel. So I'm lifting the fork up, and at the same time I'm grabbing at the base of the potato and pulling it up, and you can see some of the potatoes attached to that plant. So once I pull the potato out of the ground, I'm going to carefully remove the potatoes that are attached to the plant. Some of them are more mid-sized, some of them are real tiny, but even these tiny ones are good to eat. And then I'll set the plant aside. That could be added to my compost pile, but I haven't gotten all the potatoes yet. There's going to be some that are a little bit deeper in, so I'm going to dig around with my hands, or you could carefully use a trowel or the fork to make sure I get all the ones that were a little bit further away from the base of the plant. Don't want to miss any of those potatoes. Once they're all dug up, these potatoes are ready to be stored. These potatoes, being new potatoes, are going to be stored in the fridge because their skin is not thick enough for them to keep for a long period of time. So you can take them in, carefully wash them off, and store them in the fridge until you're ready to use them. They'll last a couple weeks in the fridge. Once the plants get more mature and start to die off, then the skins will be thicker. So the potatoes that you harvest at that later point will have thick enough skins to be able to keep them for a longer period of time. The storage potatoes will need to be cured before you store them. And curing just means you're setting them up for good storage. And the way to cure potatoes is to keep them in a cool, dark place. An air-conditioned room that has good air circulation is a fine place to keep them. Once they've cured for a couple weeks, then they should store for quite a while, especially if you can keep them in a dark, cool place. Most of us don't have places in our houses that are quite cool enough to be ideal, which is in the 45 to 50 range. So they won't necessarily stay for good for months and months and months, but you could keep them usually for a couple months before they'll start to sprout. Once they start to sprout, you want to go ahead and cut off those sprouts and eat them right away because they won't keep for long after that. When harvesting your potatoes as new potatoes, you only want to harvest what you're going to use that day or that week. When you're harvesting potatoes for storage, then you're going to go ahead and take the whole bed. So once those plants have died back or started to die back, you can go ahead and harvest the whole bed and get those ready to cure and to store. We generally only find a few varieties of potatoes at the grocery store, but potatoes actually come in hundreds of varieties. This variety right here is a purple-skinned, purple-fleshed potato. I'm gonna cut it open so you can see what it looks like inside. Look at that beautiful purple flesh. This is one of many different varieties. And these potatoes right here are also a great example of potatoes that are ready to harvest for storage. You can see that the plants are starting to die off. They're turning yellow and brown. They're not long for this world. So these potatoes could be harvested, their skins will be thicker, and they could be kept for a longer period of time outside of the fridge if you cure them properly. This is a beautiful bed of carrots that's ready to start harvesting from. One of the tricky things about carrots is being a root crop, it's hard to be able to see whether they're ready or not. So there's a couple different ways that you can tell. One is by looking, you want to gently bend the tops of the carrots over, and you'll see that some of them have the very top of the carrot root, the shoulders of the carrot, exposed. And you're looking for carrots that have a width of at least about a ½ inch or so. They could be bigger than that as well. Carrots can be harvested and eaten at any size, but to get a really good harvest out of the bed, you want to wait until it's at least about a ½ inch across the top. So some of them you'll be able to see that just by looking. For others, they'll be covered over by the soil, and so you want to take your finger and gently loosen the dirt around the top of the carrot to expose those shoulders and see if it's big enough. Once you've identified if your carrot is big enough, then you're ready to start harvesting it. There's a couple different ways that you can harvest carrots. When you're growing carrots for yourself and you want to be able to harvest them over a longer period of time, I recommend pulling them by hand so that you can individually pick out the biggest ones. In order to pull them by hand though, you want the soil to be fairly moist. So if it hasn't rained recently, you're going to want to water them in a little bit before you harvest them to moisten the ground and make it easier to pull up. Once you've identified that your carrot's ready and you've got your ground moist enough to pull it, you're going to reach down to the base of the green part and reach down firmly, grab it, and pull straight upwards. You can wiggle it a little bit if it's a little stuck, but you want to pull straight up. And then you've got a beautiful carrot. So this carrot is a really nice size. You do want to be careful about not leaving your carrots in the ground for too long because they can start to become woody or cracked or even start to rot in the ground. So once you notice that the carrot is looking big enough on the top, you want to go ahead and pull it out. Another way to harvest your carrots is using a fork or a shovel. For that, what you're going to do is take whatever you're digging with, set it 2 or 3 inches away from the carrots, straight up and down, and push it down, firmly down into the ground. Once you've gotten it down about as far as you can get it, Then you're going to gently tip it towards you, and it helps sometimes to grab the base of the carrots while you're doing that, so that as you tip and lift, you can pull the carrots out too. So these carrots are ready to be taken inside and eaten, washed and eaten right away, or if you want to store them for later, what you want to do is you want to break off the tops, and you're going to store the roots and the tops separately. The tops can actually be eaten. Not a lot of people do eat them, but they're good to use in soups in place of parsley, or you can use them to make a pesto. But whether you're using the greens or not, you want to make sure to separate them so that the carrots themselves, the roots, don't become limp. This right here is a bed of garlic. Garlic is a little bit different than some of the other annual plants that we grow in our garden in that it's planted in late fall and it starts to grow over the winter. It will really start to take off in the spring, and we're looking to harvest garlic usually sometime in June, but there are a couple other points before that where we could start to get an early harvest. One thing to know about garlic is that it comes in two main varieties, hardneck and softneck. This right here is a hardneck garlic. And hardneck garlic, usually around the beginning or middle of May, is going to shoot up a little stalk from the middle top of the plant that we call a garlic scape. Really what that is what would grow into the flower if we let it. But what you want to do with your garlic is you want to cut that scape off once it's shot up and started to form a bud but hasn't opened up. And you can actually eat those scapes. I like to call them garlicky asparagus. You can just chop them up and use them in the same way you would garlic, or saute them up and toss them in pasta or eggs. But the other thing that taking that scape will do is that it allows the plant to focus on building a nice big bulb. So then, come later in May or early June, your garlic will have bulbed up enough that you could start to harvest from it. It's not going to be fully mature yet, not mature enough to harvest to store, but it'll be mature enough to harvest and eat, and that we call green garlic. If you want to grow your garlic long enough to be able to store it, what you'll do is you'll wait until the leaves turn partway brown or yellow. You're going to wait till they're brown or yellow about halfway up the plant, maybe 3 or 4 leaves have died off, and then you know that your garlic is ready to harvest to store. In order to harvest the garlic, what you're going to do is take a fork, a shovel, or a trowel, something that you can use to kind of loosen the soil around the plant. You'll loosen it up a little bit, and once you see that it's loosened, you can just go right down there, grab it from the base, and then pull firmly up. So there's my beautiful big garlic bulb. So right now the roots are still attached, the top is still attached. If you're harvesting it at a green garlic stage, like this, where the greens are still mostly green, you're gonna wanna trim off the top. You can trim off the roots and store it in the fridge until you're ready to use it. If, however, you're waiting till the garlic is mature enough to store it before harvesting it, which again is when it gets dry about halfway up, the bottom 3 or 4 leaves are dry and yellow, then what you'll do is you'll leave that top on, and you're going to hang it or lay it in a cool, dry place that's well ventilated so that it can cure for a few weeks before then trimming off the tops and trimming off the roots and setting it somewhere again that's cool and dry and well ventilated to store. Onions are one of the easiest root crops to harvest because they're really easy to pull out of the ground without needing a tool, as long as your soil is fairly loose. They also tend to stick up above the ground so that you can see the size of the onion without having to dig it out, so it's easy to tell how big the onion is. You can harvest onions at any point in the season as long as you're going to use them right away. Some people even harvest their onions before they've bulbed up and use them as green onions. And when you're doing that, you want to make sure to use the tops, not just the bottom, because the bottom will be quite small. But you could wait for them to bulb up, and then you're going to want to look for the bigger onions to pull to start with. And in order to pull them out, you're just going to grab it right at the base firmly and pull straight up. You can jiggle a little bit if it's stuck and pull it out of the ground. So this onion is what I would call a green onion. It's not quite ready to store yet, but the greens on it are still really nice to use, as well as the bulb. So you can go ahead and use the top in your cooking as well. If you are wanting to store your onions for a longer period of time outside of the fridge, the way we would for onions that we get from the supermarket, you want to wait until your bed of onions looks about like this bed, where about a third of the tops have fallen over. That tells you that your onions are mature enough to pick for storage. Here in North Carolina though, there's a lot of heat and humidity, which makes it really hard to store your onions well here, to cure them and store them well. And so I generally recommend that even if you want to use them over a longer period of time, that you treat them as green onions and keep them in the fridge. So at this point, I would go ahead and harvest the rest of this bed, and I would trim off the tops, maybe save a few of the greens if I want to use them, but otherwise leave the bulbs in the fridge until I use them.
Tomatoes, one of the garden favorite vegetables in the summertime. There are over 4,000 different varieties of tomatoes, and as you can see here, they come in just about every color, shape, size, and flavor you can imagine. Because of all these different varieties of tomatoes, it's really important to know which ones you planted. So make sure you always consult your seed packet or your transplant tag to know what's tomato going to look like when it's ready to harvest. Here in front of me, I have what's called sun gold tomatoes. It's a cherry tomato that goes from about a light green to a beautiful, striking orange color. But again, tomatoes can go from green to red, yellow, purple, and sometimes they actually stay green and they're ripe and ready when they're green. To tell if a tomato is fully ripe, what you want to do is first watch for a color change, but it's also helpful to give it a little squeeze. If there's just a very slight give, just a little bit, but not too squishy because that might mean it's a little overripe or rotting, it's ready to eat. So these cherry tomatoes, they come off really easy. All you have to do is snap them right off the vine and they're ready to go. Other times, with some larger tomatoes, this little green part on top called the calyx will come off as well, and that's not an issue. It can stay on, you can flick it off, it doesn't make a difference. If you are harvesting some of these larger tomatoes, it can be helpful to grasp the plant in one hand and lightly twist and pull your tomato off it. If it's giving you a hard time, you can also always bring out some clippers. For harvesting and then storing the fresh tomatoes, it's important to never put them in the fridge. It will change the taste of your tomatoes if you put them in a refrigerator. So we always recommend keeping them on your countertop, and they can store for a few days if they're just fresh and all the way mature like these sun golds are, or it can take a few weeks if they're under mature. So I've got two different under mature tomatoes here in front of me. These both should be red at full maturity. This one has a little bit of color. You can see just a little rose color on what we call the shoulders or the top, whereas this one is full-blown green. This tomato will never ripen up, and you should use it for fried green tomatoes or other preparations you know of for a fully green tomato. This one, over the course of a few days to a few weeks, especially if you keep it in a brown paper bag, will begin to ripen and have that full red color of a mature, delicious tomato.
The first thing to know about harvesting okra is that it can be pretty uncomfortable. The stiff hairs on the leaves and on the stem make a lot of people itch, so it's a good thing to wear gloves or even a long sleeve shirt for. The next thing to know about okra is that it grows really, really fast, and the pods will quickly become over mature and tough. So you want to make sure you stay on top of it, harvesting okra every day or every other day so that the pods don't get too big or too tough in between, like this one right here did. When you're harvesting okra, you're going to find the pod, and you can use a knife or a pair of clippers to do this, and you're cutting it right on the little stem below the pod like this. Ideally, you want to harvest most okra varieties between 1 and 4 inches long before they get really big and tough. If they have gotten longer than that, you can give them a little feel. If they still feel tender and have a little bend to them, they might still be good to eat. But if they feel really stiff and hard like this one, you just want to toss that in the compost. It is still really good to cut them off though, even if they've gotten too big to eat, so that they're not sapping energy from the plant. If you're not going to eat the okra right away, you can keep it in the fridge in a paper or plastic bag until you do. It will last about a week that way. You can start harvesting basil at any stage, but it's best to start when the plant is at least about a foot tall so that it has enough growth that it can sustain the harvest and not lose too much energy. To harvest basil, there's a few different methods to do. You can pick individual leaves like this, or you can pick whole clusters of leaves. If you're going to pick a whole cluster, the place that you pick it is kind of important. You want to pick it just above the next node or the next set of leaf shoots. That way, those next little leaves, the energy will go to them and they'll start to grow big like the top one you just picked. Basil doesn't store very well, so it's best eaten fresh, which is one of the reasons why it's great to have it in your own garden. But if you aren't going to eat it all right away, you want to make sure to keep it very dry and store it dry, and try and keep it in the warmest part of your fridge in a bag. Basil does not like to be wet and it doesn't like to get cold. If either of those things happen, it's likely to turn black and not really be usable anymore. One other way to harvest basil is to take the whole stem part way down, not going all the way to the base of the plant, but again going down to a next kind of leaf node, a few nodes down, and cut a whole stem like this. If you cut it in that way, then you could keep it in a little cup with a little bit of water at the base, the same way you would a bouquet of flowers, and keep it on your counter in your kitchen, somewhere where it's not in direct sunlight. That way it can last almost a week. One thing to pay attention to on your basil is to look out for if it's starting to flower. We can see that this plant here is starting to send off a little flower shoot, and when that happens, you want to make sure to go ahead and harvest those instead of letting them actually go to flower. So I'm going to pinch that off in the same way, and we can use that as part of our harvest. The reason to watch out for these and make sure you pick them instead of letting them go is that if you let them go to flower, the plant is going to focus more on those flowers and stop focusing as much on the leaves, which will start to get a little bit sharper in flavor and a little bit bitter.
Cucumbers are another great summer crop. Like tomatoes and a number of other plants, it's important to know the variety so you know when to harvest them. Most cucumbers are, of course, your common slicer cucumbers that are green, fairly straight, about 8 to 12 inches long. But depending on the variety you grow, they could be yellow, they could be white, they could be really small, they could get pretty big, so know what you planted. To determine, though, when it's ready to plant, most of the times you're going to look at the diameter of your cucumber. Oftentimes they'll reach their terminal or end length and then kind of fill out. Oftentimes, if they're a little immature, they'll have some ridges still that are fairly obvious, and this one has just a few ridges, but it's really starting to fill out. On the flip side, you might have some cucumbers that are a little overgrown. So this one right here, this yellow one's very swollen, its seeds are probably very mature and developed, not super tasty, and has become a little bit bitter. This one is a little bit less advanced, but it's still oversized and will not taste so good. Cucumbers, though, are harvestable at really any stage, so you can get them as small as you like, all the way up to a nice full-size cucumber. For these variety, again, their end size will be between 8 and 12 inches long, but check your seed packet. Last thing I wanted to point out before we harvest one is that sometimes they can grow a little bit funny. So in this instance, it's still perfectly edible, but it has this strange sort of shrunken middle section. Still delicious, still super healthy to get, but you will want to harvest this because it's not going to get much bigger and fill out that section. So now let's take a look at this cucumber, which is just about ready. I like them to be a little immature. I think they're a little bit sweeter than the big full-sized ones. Oftentimes what you want to do is actually spin it off the vine itself. This is an easy way to break it off the plant, and it leaves just a little bit of this vine still attached, which can be really great for keeping it fresh in the refrigerator. If you're having a hard time breaking it off, you can always pull out your clippers and just clip the top right off the plant itself. Once you have all the cucumbers you want, you should put them in your refrigerator, and they'll store between a week and 2 weeks, especially if you keep them in a plastic bag or in the crisper drawer inside the refrigerator. I don't know if you can tell, but it's about 1,000 degrees out today, so I'm really excited for our next crop. We're here in our watermelon patch at the Camden Garden, and these sugar baby watermelon are just about ready to harvest. It's kind of tough to tell when watermelon are ready, and so I want you just to keep in mind all of these tips we give you, because all of them together can be an indicator that your melon's ready. But if you get it wrong the first couple times, don't be discouraged, because even professional watermelon growers can mess it up. So the first thing to remember is the days to harvest. On your seed packet or on your plant label, it should tell you how many days it will take to harvest your plant. We know that these sugar babies take about 70 to 80 days to be ready to harvest, and so we're right in that perfect window. The next thing to look for is a dried up tendril. So you take a look over here on the vine itself where the watermelon connects to the rest of the plant. I can see that there's a little brown tendril, which is just a small vine opposite growing where the melon itself is. As it dries up, it's a clear sign that the melon's just about ready to harvest. Another sign is the sound of your watermelon. You might have heard or seen folks do this at the grocery store sometimes and wondering what they're doing, but you're just thumping it for a deep sound. That's usually an indicator that it's grown to full size, it's filled with water, and it's ready to eat. Sometimes the smaller ones you can tap on to sort of calibrate your ear, and it'll be a more high-pitched tinny sound than the nice deep thud of a ready watermelon. Another sign is that the skin is beginning to dull a little bit and get less shiny compared to the other melons, and it might be a little bit harder or rougher and won't bruise or break as easily with a fingernail. The last thing I want you to point your attention to is the bottom. This is where the melon was growing on the ground, and it forms a clear yellow spot where it didn't get any sun. This is yet another sign that the melon's really at the ideal time to harvest. It's important to remember, though, that once you harvest the plant, it's not going to ripen anymore on your countertop like a tomato might, so you really want to try to shoot for the most ripe. Once you've got your your watermelon all ready and harvested, it's best to eat it right away, but if you need to keep it in the fridge for a few weeks, that works out as well.
Many of the health benefits of growing your own garden stem from having access to all that nutrient-rich fresh produce, but there are some other health benefits as well. It's certainly not an aerobic activity, but gardening does provide some amount of physical activity, and it can be a great way to move around and to use your body. One person that we installed a garden box for shared that she had purposefully selected a small watering can to water her garden with so that she would have to walk back and forth from the spigot more in the process. But even without intentionally making your job harder, you are bound to get some steps, some bends, and some squats in. Gardening also gives you an excuse to get outside in the fresh air and soak up some sun to boost your vitamin D while doing something calming and meditative. For many, spending time in the garden is a great stress relief and mindfulness practice. Gardening can also be a great way to spend time with loved ones, friends, and neighbors. The act of gardening itself, as well as the food it produces, can be a great way to bring people together around a shared experience. Gardens often spark conversations and can be a way for people to forge or deepen relationships as they connect over gardening tips, favorite recipes, or memories of their grandparents' gardens. And then, of course, there are the many, many benefits you get from eating the food itself.
Now that we've come to the end of our course, we want to make sure you have both the confidence and knowledge to go forward and start or continue your gardening journey. Since we are all constantly learning new things, it's important to take note of where to turn to for more quality information. In the back of the Seed to Supper manual, you'll find a very helpful appendix chock full of resources on all the topics we've covered in this class. Many of the specific resources in the appendix are geared towards North Carolina and the Southeast in general, but most information can be used by gardeners all over the country. Take some time to browse the sections on resources for gardening on a budget, some of the useful reference images of trellising and tools, and many of the online links under the additional gardening information section. We've often referred your attention to getting in contact with your local extension office. Cooperative Extension is a local, state, and national service designed to serve their community's needs in agriculture, health, and other human services. Local cooperative extension offices can provide you with free or low-cost information through classes, handouts, and personal consultations on every topic we've covered in this class. Take some time to get familiar with what your local extension office has to offer. Finally, we encourage you to find like-minded people to garden with in your area. It can be one of the most rewarding things to garden with a community, working together and sharing your challenges and successes with others.
Once you've harvested your homegrown fruits and vegetables, it's time to eat them. Incorporating fruits and veggies into your diet is super important for your health. Eating just 2 cups of vegetables a day can help lower your risk for heart disease, high blood pressure, and certain types of cancers. Additionally, vegetables are high in fiber, low in calories, and chock full of nutrients. For example, this sweet potato is high in iron, B vitamins, and potassium. This bright yellow summer squash is high in vitamin C, magnesium, and riboflavin. And this lovely dinosaur kale is high in vitamins A, K, B6, and it's also known as a superfood for its high antioxidant content. Here are 3 final tips to help you stay healthy. The first tip is to make sure you're filling half your plate with fruits and vegetables. The second tip is to eat a rainbow, and that just means you're eating different colored fruits and vegetables to ensure you get a variety of nutrients and vitamins. The third tip is to eat seasonally. Your vegetables will be fresher and most nutritious right when they're harvested, so eat with the seasons. Within this manual, you will find additional nutrition information, healthy seasonal recipes, and more information about integrating your garden harvest into your diet.